What's up, y'all? Welcome into the LA Sports Brotherhood. It's me, Ryan, here with my brother Matthew, and we are beginning our multi-week journey into examining the history of Lincoln Riley at USC. There's a lot of options to talk about, a lot of different facets to success in college football, and we're gonna take a more objective, deeper look into each of those things: recruiting, scheme, stuff like that. We're starting with recruiting today, as the title suggested. But in our previous video, we talked a lot about like the general failures, or at least how we perceive to be as failures in Riley's time here, specifically with this season, like kind of the aftermath of that. And we got a lot of interaction with that, a lot of different opinions and stuff, and we really appreciate it. Like, truly, it's really nice to hear different comments from different people. We wanted to be a little more objective here, so if there's something we think is positive, we're going to talk about it. But also, if something's negative, and certainly there is, we're going to talk about that too. So please continue to let us know how you feel, especially if you disagree. Definitely love hearing different viewpoints. But Matt, like I said, we're starting with recruiting. So let's take this from. Actually, I'll let you establish where we take it from. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm gonna try to, like you said, not be a USC fan, just kind of objectively look at the recruiting. And so far, it's been poor. I mean, we're talking about USC here, a powerhouse, a blue blood, 11 national championships, 8 Heisman's. You expect a top in the 2000. You expect a top 3, 5 class. Right now, you'd expect a top 10 class every cycle. And 2022, I'm not really gonna look at 2022 because it was a short class, we only had 8
Yeah.
players. But the composite rank was 70th. 2023 was 8th. That was his only good class. It's also fitting that came after his only good year here so far in 3 years at USC. 2024, 17th, which is terrible, and so far this 2024 or 2025, excuse me, which isn't finished, is sitting at 13 right now, and that's not good. It's not even close to being good, especially for USC. And there's a lot of factors in this. I think the most upsetting for USC fans is the lack of California recruiting. And if the Fox Sports actually put out a graphic, it was the last 5 USC coaches and the percentage of high schoolers enrolled or high schoolers signed from California at USC. Pete Carroll was 73%, Lane Kiffin 70.4%, Steve Sarkisian in the playoffs 78%, Clay Helton 57, and Lincoln Riley was at 42, which is astoundingly low. I mean, it's insane. Alabama has signed more high schoolers from California, which is just very upsetting for USC fans. And so, to me, there's multiple factors going into this. So, to answer the question, why has he not recruited California? I think the first big one is where Clay Helton and Lincoln Riley, because Lincoln Riley hasn't been good either, how they've set us back. So, like the kids growing up now, they're in high school right now. What are they looking at? Where do they want to go? They don't care about Pete Carroll anymore. That's way long gone. They don't. That's what their parents talk about. And so you look around. Forget NIL because I'm gonna get into that's obviously the second factor.
Yeah.
Forget that. You want development. You want a culture. You want to play in front of. You want what does a high schooler think is cool? You look up at Oregon. You see those jerseys. You see those fans. You see the culture. You see how they develop you into pros. Georgia, the same thing. Alabama, the same thing. You look at USC, what does it really have? It doesn't have the fans going to every game, doesn't have the same culture. It, they haven't really developed NFL talent, and more importantly, they're not playing in the big games. You watch the game with Michigan, Oregon, excuse me, Michigan, Ohio State. You watch the Iron Bowl. Like USC is so far behind compared to these other powerhouse schools currently in terms of the culture, and more importantly, in terms of winning. And so well, all these teams stepped up their facilities, their NIL, and they're playing these big games. They're winning. They're going to be in the playoffs. USC has just slowly and slowly just continued to take steps back. And you look at that, you look at it now in 2024. What does it really have to offer? So, I mean, that's the first big reason. You know, Clay Helton, Lane Kiffin, that whole era of USC football that's still going on because we're still not good. Really set us back to the point where now these high school recruits, they think about Oregon, they think about Bama, they think about Georgia, they think about Ohio State, and now we really have to catch up. So
Yeah.
that's to me the biggest reason why they're not coming to California. And I feel like the counter to that, and I agree with this by the way, is it is a lot different now to recruit California than in the Pete Carroll era because of NIL, because it's so nationwide. Like it is not Before, it might have been crazy for a California recruit to go to Alabama. It's really not anymore. Kids travel, so you can't really just rely on California. I do like the idea. Like I do like Cameron Fountain. I like a kid from Georgia. I like a kid from Texas. So I'm not saying you only have to recruit California, but you have to start with California. You have to prioritize California because a number that's very, very scary. Do you know? Forget 2023, 2023, 2024, 2025. Do you know how many modern day and St. John Bosco signees we've had? We've had one, and it was Marcellus Williams, whose brother played on USC.
Yeah.
That is the biggest problem. I mean, that's insane. One, the two best schools in the country within I don't know how many miles. The point is, it's in Southern California. You got one player from those two schools in 3 years as the head coach of USC football. And to me, that is just the biggest problem. And so the point recruiting overall has not been good. And I think the biggest problem is his lack of emphasis on California. Because you could say, oh, it's harder. It's different than the Pete Carroll era. You didn't even recruit Nate Frazier, and now he's going to be starting next year. He's getting legit carries for a college football playoff team, and you did not bother to recruit him.
Yeah.
That to me is the problem. It's not necessarily the number. And if you look at 2025, so far 21 signings, only 5 from California. And I could keep going on. 2024, 22 signings, 7 from California. It's not necessarily the number. It's the lack of emphasis, and more importantly, if you're at Bosco and Mater Dei, why would you go there? Like, why would you go to USC? The whole talk, the reason we're talking about it, the whole talk around Lincoln Riley is he doesn't recruit California. So if you're a highly touted California kid, you think, oh, he doesn't care about me. I can go wear super nice jerseys at Oregon, play in the playoffs, play in front of a bunch of amazing fans. That to me is when you look from the high schooler perspective, why would you go to USC other than your parents really want you to go there?
Yeah.
And so that's the problem. And so, first of all, do you agree? And second, do you think Lincoln Riley can change this, or do you think the only change that could happen would be to get a new head coach? Like, do you think he can turn around this like? Do you think he can turn it around and start recruiting California and prove to the coaches of the California schools and also the player of California schools that no, like we take this serious. This is the emphasis.
Yeah. I think the second point that you mentioned about like the relationships he has with people in California that influence decisions for these kids is probably the most important, because you said you brought up NIL and didn't really touch on it, of course, because you're explaining everything else. I'll bring that up. I think to your first point, your first question about whether Lincoln can turn it around, I think the reason that these classes have been so underwhelming, because you said, like, as you were listing the class ranking for each year, all of them were top 15. I think one was 17. So like that's not bad. But before, like immediately after hiring Lincoln Riley, if you told someone, if you had someone guess what is USC, that brand coupled with Lincoln Riley, one of the most high-powered names in college in the sport, what do those recruiting classes look like? I don't know how many people would be saying objectively anything outside of the top 10. And we had one class inside the top 10, and I brought this up because I wanted to look. 5 of the top 8 of those players all transferred out. So you get some guys, but you don't retain them. And I maybe that's an NIL problem. As we keep talking, we'll get more into that. But the point is, I don't think firing Riley is the solution to this specific problem. Again, as we expand our thoughts and more videos, we'll talk more about his staying power here. But specifically recruiting, if Lincoln Riley and USC, the letters recruit themselves, like that's what everyone was saying with Clay Helton, to kind of undermine his recruiting woes, like even more. It's like he's so bad that he can't even recruit at SC. Like no one's gonna say that about Lincoln Riley because he recruited everywhere. So it is a foundational problem with SC, like we talked about in our last video. It's very much more based off NIL failure and the difference in priorities for these players, and more importantly, their families / handlers, the people that handle the recruiting process. But I think the difference between me and a lot of SC fans, even in our comments in the last video, like they're talking about how it's not just an SC problem, it's a league wide, it's a sport wide problem. And it's like, yes, I actually talk about this with my friend a lot. It is very much like kind of the beginning of the end of college football. But we're still playing, we're still watching. So USC has to decide whether they're going to participate in college football or just kind of fall to the background and just have a nice coach that says cool things and runs a kind of cool offense. Because that's like an actual, like, we're at a pivot point now. We can't just say, oh, well, the whole sport's screwed up. You can stop watching, which is perfectly fine. Whatever, stop being a fan, love the school, whatever, kind of passively pay attention. But if you're going to be this committed football fan that talks about SC in this high echelon, then you have to expect them to operate in that way. And I keep beating this point over the head, but that's the reality. If it's like, you can't hate what's going on and then be jealous and upset about other schools committing to this process and succeeding, and then being like, oh, well, SC can't do that. Like, if SC can't do that, then who the hell can? Anyway, so beyond that, I do think, specifically talking about California, this is going to potentially be upsetting. I kind of, so technically disagreeing with you, but I mostly agree with you. I think the California thing's overblown. You do have to recruit nationwide, specifically in the transfer portal era, because you cannot have zero communication with these high 5-star kids that transfer out. And this is a completely different game, so I understand why people don't really like it. But you have to know all of these kids. You have to at least know their parent or their high school coach or their trainer or their 7-on-7 coach. Like, you have to recruit them at all times, because when they transfer, and it's not even if anymore, when they transfer after a year or two, you have to be able to bring them in. You can't start from nothing unless you have insane NIL packages for transfers. So I do think the approach isn't incorrect, but when you're talking about, sorry, you really yelled into there. It's on the mic peak. But when you talk about, I remember you said Frazier specifically that went to Georgia. That was one of the craziest cases of it, because that one felt like he's specifically ignoring California. Like on the USCFootball.com boards, they talk about their insiders like bring a lot of stuff to us. Oh, us, I don't subscribe anymore, but he was like, Nate Frazier wants to visit SC. They're not really recruiting him, so he's kind of just like waiting around. And then it's like, okay, I guess I'll go to Georgia. And he's playing like big time snaps as a true freshman. And there's a lot of stories like that with different California recruits. And that is absolutely unacceptable. That's not just a one off thing. Like when Riley was chasing Dylan Raiola around everywhere, Julian Sayin, 5-star quarterback from Calabasas or Carlsbad, excuse me, from California, from Southern California, he was legitimately on USC's campus trying to talk to Lincoln Riley, a true 5-star quarterback. And Riley was like, nah, I kind of want Raiola. I'm not talking to anyone else. So, and then when Raiola didn't commit to them, because he was never going to commit to them, Riley tried to talk to Sayin again. And Sayin on campus was like, no, you didn't want to talk to us. So he's like, not only not recruiting, he's actively burning bridges with very high profile California recruits. And that is where we could talk about unacceptable. Like, that is where the actual issue with the California stuff. Because if the whole class is not primarily California, that's not a failure, because you're getting some good guys, especially the guys you get from Georgia, like Cam Fountain and stuff. Braylon Shelby's from Texas is great. But you cannot neglect the high-level California players, and that, I think, is what the actual issue is. He's been doing that, whether it's because of NIL or other reasons. Like, that's just not an excuse. That's where my actual fault is.
Yeah, and that's my problem. It's not with the 42% number, because I feel like that number, no matter who the coach is, that number is gonna be lower. Because college football is different than the Carroll era. It's just different. You like you said, you have to recruit nationally. But when you're ignoring Frazier, like you said, when you're ignoring Sayin, like you said, it's not acceptable. And again, to me, what's unacceptable is having sports writers write articles about the disconnect between Lincoln and Bosco and Lincoln and Mater Dei. It's like Mater Dei was our feeder, and I'm trying not to get emotional USC fan, but it's so frustrating the fact that Mater Dei just doesn't want to go to USC anymore. It's the best school in the country by a mile. You know who's even close to them is St. John Bosco, who you also don't want to recruit. And that's the biggest problem because you know who's recruiting in California? Oregon. Look at their team. You know who's recruiting in California? Alabama. And that's what's unacceptable. USC, it used to be to where like these East Coast South teams wouldn't even bother recruiting in California because they were going to go to UC. If they're a 5-star prospect, they're going to go to UC. That will never happen again. I don't care if you bring Nick Saban back. That will never happen again. College football is just different. But to me, with NIL, and again, there's nothing we can say about NIL about to start paying the players. UC, like we're not going to get the
Yeah,
House of Victory to like. There's nothing we could say. There's nothing we could say, so we're not really going to touch on it. It's obviously a big factor. But if you do have money to spend, what I'll say, you have limited funds. You're not Oregon or Miami A&M. You have limited funds. What I'll say is pay the California kids because it's going to be pretty hard to try to get Justice Terry, to get Isaiah Gibson,
yeah,
and in the state of Georgia, where they could easily go to Georgia and become an NFL guy. It's going to be hard to pay them to kind of get them to come here. Why not just pay that blue chip prospects, here? That's what I'll say. If they're trying to pay a certain amount of players, I would prefer to play the California kids because how many freaking decommitments have we seen in the past 2 years? I could name about 5 blue chip prospects. To me, that's a problem. And again, the way I'll answer my own question from a while back when I was saying, is there a way that Lincoln Riley can fix it, or do we have to fire him in terms of recruiting the California kids and building that relationship with Mater Dei again and Bosco? I think first of all, you just got to win. 6 wins isn't going to cut. No one's going to want to go to a 6-win team. First of all, you got to win. Secondly, you got to get this 2026 class. You actually just got a huge commitment from a Rancho Cucamonga 4-star cornerback. Lockhart, another 4-star cornerback from California. You're heavily linked to Ryder Lyons, who's also from California. You get a class with a lot of California kids, and you prove that you can develop them into NFL players, and they stay here. They don't enter the transfer portal after 1 year. If you can get a class from California, produce them into NFL talent, and prove to the high school kids, to the high school coaches, that you're serious about this, and it's a good place to go to develop, I think that's step one. But the problem with that is these 3 kids aren't from Mater Dei and Bosco. But, I mean, you got to start somewhere. It's going to be a slow process in order to get these kids back on your good side because they have now seen the blueprint. Bryce Young, Heisman number 1 overall pick, went to Alabama from Mater Dei. Mateo Uiagalelei. We'll see how Kingston plays off. All these kids that went elsewhere, they found success. So if you're following their footsteps from the same school, why would you go to USC if all those kids found success elsewhere? So I think if you're Lincoln Riley, you got to prove that you can develop these guys into NFL guys. Because NIL stuff aside, culture, uniforms, the bottom line, these kids are competitive. These kids want to go to the NFL. So if you can prove that, I think that's the first step in order to turn this California thing around.
Yeah. I really like the point you brought up at the beginning of your statement. It's not as if it's formal. When you're talking about reaching for massive commitments from guys in very competitive states like Georgia or Florida, like we've lost some guys to, that is the actual biggest issue in this era, I think, is because they do have some NIL power. To get those guys to commit at all, you have to have an NIL commitment, like USC going to the player. But the issue is they're going for, like you said, these massive, massive recruits that people like schools like Georgia don't miss those guys. They just don't. That's why they're good. And they will do everything in their power to keep them because they're in their home state and they don't let out of state powers come into their state and get their best players. So when you're committing that money to people that these kids know are not going to be there, or like they don't know who they are, but you have different guys like in the top 10 for 2025 class, 3 Alabama guys, 2 A&M guys, 3 Penn State guys, a Miami guy, and Houston Longstreet who's going to SC, which wasn't even the case because they were going after a Georgia quarterback when they had multiple 5 stars in their state. Again, everyone liked Juju Lewis. I was never too high on him because he's a reclass quarterback. I'm not going to talk crap about him anyway because he's a child. But that's the actual issue. I think that's the best point, and either of us brought up today, is that if you do have limited NIL resources, be smart about how you use it. That's probably actually the most frustrating thing. I'm like really glad you brought it up because that really made me think about so many times they've missed on guys that they could have, if they just gave the same package to guys that are in the area that are 20 minutes away from the school, or like just like within driving distance of the school, you could just keep them here. They would be here. Even if you're just like, oh, I don't even want, they're all about NIL, whatever. If you think they go out of state for people that really want to be at USC, you are sorely mistaken. It's all NIL regardless. NIL slash, as you mentioned, draftability, especially for the players that like have forward thought and aren't just like really committed to making as much money like in this present moment. You have to show multiple levels, and USC is not showing anything to anybody. Definitely not in California. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it's not even just lack of NIL in general. It's when you do muster that up, you give it to the wrong people, and like not even hindsight wrong people. It's like, do you think USC with Lincoln Riley, the reputation of having the most embarrassing defense in the last 10 years for like a good coach, is gonna steal a 5-star interior defensive lineman from Georgia? Like that's what you think is gonna happen? It's nice to have the headline in the summer, but when they decommit and then the rest of the class decommits off the back of them committing because you think you're building this momentum, what the hell's the point? They just set you back a couple months and you're starting over, and all the kids you could have started the relationships with, they already talked to other people. So it's a horrible mismanagement of assets. I think that's what it really boils down to. Beyond even the NIL disparity and stuff. Like you have to know what you're doing. And I don't think USC's adjusted to the NIL era yet. And that's not an excuse because you have to. It's sink or swim. Truly.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll say, really, the point here is just it's all been mismanagement in terms of guys you didn't recruit, guys you've lost out on, like Connerly, Mateo, Madden, whoever. So we're losing out on guys. We're losing battles to these schools. We're not recruiting certain guys that turn out to be stars, and we have mismanagement of NIL. That's really what this comes down to, and that's bigger than just California.
Yeah.
So what I'll say is I think it's pathetic to, as a USC fan, say, oh, it's NIL, like Oregon's paying them, Bama's paying them. What are we gonna do? It's like you're USC, man. You're USC. You're one of the very powerhouses in the country. To sit there and plain about, oh, they have more money. It's like a freaking Twins fan or something. For those of you that watch baseball, like one of these terrible organizations, like the A's, saying, oh, they have more money. You're USC. You have freaking Eric Henderson as your D-line coach. Lincoln Riley's supposed to be this offensive mastermind who's produced 3 Heismans. And like the brand of USC. And not to mention, you're in LA. You should be able to have NIL to pay these players. So to sit there and blame it on NIL rather than trying to make an effort to prove that you can recruit these guys, I think that's a problem in itself. And so, and this is a bigger problem than the transfer portal. And something we didn't really touch on is, or you did touch on it about the 2023 class. Also, these guys leaving after 1 year. That's a problem. I'll tell you right now, Deuce Robinson would not have left USC if he didn't have to. He loved being at USC, but he had to go because he's not going to sit there and play half the snaps he should. He was only going to leave if he had to go, and he felt like he had to go, and that's a big problem. So the recruiting, objectively, again, USC bias aside, it hasn't been good. They haven't recruited California well. They've missed out on guys. They haven't gone there now together. So far in this process of Lincoln Riley, we'll talk about the culture, whatever, the play calling. So far, recruiting hasn't been great.
Yeah. Just thanks for the little summary there. You briefly got into snap count and stuff. That's definitely going to be addressed in one of the later episodes. Like I said, this is going to be a weekly occurrence where we don't know the amount of episodes yet. It will be more than 2 or 3. But however, whatever we feel, if you guys come up with more ideas, like thinking about specific areas that we need to address, definitely leave them in the comments. We'll get to those too. It's exciting to talk about because we love USC football and love talking about it. But at the same time, kind of sucks because mostly negative stuff. Regardless, we're here. We're going to talk about more and more. We're getting recruiting news again. Like you just mentioned, Rodney Sermon's son in 2026 committed to SC. as a quarterback. So there's a lot of news still coming out. We got a couple transfers in for this upcoming cycle. We're going to talk about that too. A lot of stuff going on. We will be here to cover it all. Thanks for watching. Bye now.